Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into the ancient mists of time, back to a place that would one day become one of the world's greatest cities. Dim your lights now. Let the shadows gather softly around you. Pull that blanket up to your chin and settle into your most comfortable position. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the timeless story of London. Not the bustling metropolis you might know, but its quiet, ancient origins that stretch back through millennia like gentle ripples on the Thames. If this calm journey helps you unwind tonight, tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure, just a gentle invitation to join our community of fellow dreamers who find peace in the whispered stories of the past. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow. Can you hear that? It's the soft murmur of history calling to us across 2,000 years, inviting us to walk the misty paths of ancient Londinium, to feel the cool morning air of Roman Britain against our skin, to witness the birth of a legend. Let me take you there, to a time when the great city was nothing more than a dream in the minds of ambitious Romans, a vision waiting to unfold along the banks of a winding river. Let me tell you about a river that has seen everything. Picture, if you will, the Thames as it was 2,000 years ago. Not the busy waterway lined with bridges and buildings that we know today, but a wild, meandering ribbon of water flowing through marshland and forest, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of peoples who would shape history. The year was 43 AD, and if you had stood on what we now call the South Bank, you would have seen something remarkable beginning to unfold. The Roman legions had crossed the Channel, their bronze armor glinting in the pale English sun, their sandaled feet making the first organized march across this misty island. But let me slow down. Let me take you there more gently, because this story deserves to be savored like warm honey on a cold morning. Imagine the sound first, the gentle lapping of water against muddy banks, the soft rustle of reeds in the breeze, the distant call of water birds that had known this river for centuries before any human settlement dared to claim its shores. The air would have been clean and crisp, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, unmarked by the smoke of countless fires that would one day rise from a great city's hearths. Now picture a small group of Celtic Britons, perhaps members of the Catuvallani tribe, making their way along a narrow track beside the river. They've been trading here for generations, crossing at the shallow ford, where the river narrows, where the gravel beneath their feet provides sure footing, even when the winter rains have swelled the Thames. They know every bend of this waterway, every seasonal mood, every hidden danger and secret blessing it offers. These weren't primitive people, you understand. Let me paint you a clearer picture of these ancient Britons, because history has sometimes been unfair to them. They worked iron with skill that would impress modern blacksmiths, created pottery that was both beautiful and practical, and had trading networks that stretched across Europe. Their settlements were organized and prosperous, their warriors fierce, and their merchants shrewd. When they gathered around their evening fires, the flames dancing in the darkness, they told stories that had been passed down through countless generations, tales of gods and heroes, of the spirits that lived in the river and the woods, of the old ways that connected them to the very soul of the land. But change was coming, carried on the disciplined march of Roman legions. Can you hear it in the distance? The rhythmic tramp of hobnailed sandals on hard-packed earth, the clink and rattle of armor and weapons, the shouted commands in Latin that would soon echo across British hillsides and valleys. The Romans weren't just conquerors, they were builders, organizers, dreamers of empire who saw potential where others saw only wilderness. General Aulus Plautius, leading the Roman invasion, had his engineers and surveyors constantly at work, their trained eyes always seeking the perfect spot for the next fort, the next settlement, the next link in the great chain of Roman civilization. And when they reached the Thames, when they stood where London Bridge would one day span the water, they saw something that made them pause and point and begin making calculations on their wax tablets. Here was a river deep enough for their ships, but narrow enough to bridge. Here were hills on the north bank that could be fortified, providing a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. Here was a natural crossing point that had been used by traders for centuries, a place where roads would naturally converge, where goods and people would flow like water finding its level. The Romans had found their spot. But let's not rush ahead to legions and construction. Let's linger here in this moment of possibility, when London was still just a gleam in a Roman engineer's eye, when the future was as misty and uncertain as a Thames fog in early morning. Feel the soft grass beneath your feet as we stand on Ludgate Hill, where St. Paul's Cathedral would one day rise, but which was then just a gentle slope dotted with oak trees and threaded with deer paths. The ancient Britons had a name for this area, Lindin, meaning lake fort, or perhaps settlement by the pool, referring to the marshy areas that surrounded the higher ground. The Romans, with their gift for practical adaptation, would transform this into Londinium, a name that would echo through history and eventually become simply London. But names are just the beginning of stories, aren't they? The real magic lies in the daily lives of the people who would make this place their home. Picture now the first Roman merchants arriving at this crossing point, their pack animals laden with goods from across the empire. Imagine them meeting the local Britons, the cautious negotiations conducted in a mixture of Latin, Celtic languages, and the universal language of gestures and gold. These weren't dramatic confrontations from a Hollywood film. They were the quiet, practical interactions that actually build civilizations, one conversation and one transaction at a time. The Roman traders brought wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, pottery from distant workshops, silk that had traveled the length of the known world. In return, they sought British wool, prized throughout the empire for its quality, silver from Welsh mines, pearls from Scottish waters, and most importantly, slaves to work the growing Roman estates. It sounds harsh to our modern ears, doesn't it? But this was the reality of the ancient world, and understanding it helps us appreciate how far we've come in our ideas about human dignity and freedom. As autumn approached in that first year of Roman occupation, as the leaves on the riverside willows began to turn gold and drift down to the water, the first permanent Roman structures were taking shape. Not the grand buildings that would come later, but practical things, a wooden bridge across the Thames, a fortified compound on the north bank, warehouses for storing goods, barracks for the soldiers who would guard this vital crossing point. The sound of construction would have filled the air, the ring of hammers on metal, the rasp of saws cutting timber, the shouts of workers hauling stones and beams into place. But underneath it all, always underneath, was the river itself, flowing quietly toward the sea, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of peoples old and new, indifferent to human plans, yet somehow essential to their fulfillment. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the cooking fires were lit, when the Roman soldiers gathered to share their rations and the British workers returned to their own hearths, there would have been a moment of quiet understanding. They were building something together, something that would outlast their individual lives, something that would grow and change and endure through centuries of triumph and disaster, war and peace, feast and famine. This was the first whisper of London's voice, barely audible above the gentle murmur of the Thames, but carrying within it the seeds of everything that was to come. As you drift toward sleep tonight, can you hear it? That ancient whisper calling across 2,000 years, inviting you to witness the birth of a legend, the quiet beginning of one of history's greatest stories. Let me take you now to a London that had learned to dream bigger dreams, to build with stone instead of wood, to think not just in years, but in centuries. We're moving forward through time to the 2nd century AD, when Londinium had become the jewel of Roman Britain, a city that would have made you gasp in wonder if you had approached it from the river on a golden afternoon, watching its red-tiled roofs catch the sunlight like scattered rubies. Picture yourself as a traveler arriving by ship, sailing up the Thames from the coast, where your vessel had navigated the treacherous sandbanks and tidal marshes that guarded the river's mouth. As you round the final bend, there it is, Londinium spreading across the hills like an amphitheater built for giants, with the great bridge spanning the river like a stone rainbow, and the forest of masts in the harbor telling stories of trade routes that stretched to the edges of the known world. But what would have struck you most, what would have made you understand that this was no mere frontier settlement, but a proper Roman city, was the Wall. Ah, the London Wall. Let me tell you about this magnificent achievement, this boundary between civilization and wilderness that would define the city's shape for more than 1,000 years to come. Construction began around 190 AD in the reign of Emperor Commodus, though the wall wouldn't be completed for another decade. Imagine the scene as the project got underway. Thousands of workers swarming over the chosen route like ants, building something far greater than themselves. There were Roman engineers with their precise instruments, surveying the line the wall would take. British laborers who knew the local stone and could spot the best quarries. Gaulish masons whose grandfathers had built walls for Caesar himself. Germanic specialists in mixing the perfect mortar that would hold fast through British winters and summers alike. The wall they built was a marvel, nearly 3 miles long, curving around the landward side of the city like a protective arm. It stood 20 feet high in most places, thick enough for soldiers to walk along its top, strong enough to support the latest Roman artillery. But let me paint you a more intimate picture of what this wall meant to the people who lived in its shadow. Picture a young British girl named Vina, perhaps 12 years old, whose family had been potters for 3 generations. Her workshop sat just inside the wall near what would one day be called Cripplegate, and every morning she would wake to the sound of the watchman changing guard on the ramparts above her head. The wall was the rhythm of her days. The horn that signaled the opening of the gates at dawn, the tramp of feet as the day watch took their positions, the echo of voices calling to each other across the towers in the evening. Venus family made pottery for both the Roman market and the British one, fine red Samian ware that copied the styles popular in Gaul, and rougher, more practical vessels decorated with the swirling patterns that spoke to British hearts. Their kilns sent up a steady stream of smoke that mingled with 100 others, creating the aromatic haze that hung over the city like a blessing from the gods of hearth and home. But the wall meant more to Vena's family than just the rhythm of daily security. It meant prosperity. You see, London's wall didn't just keep enemies out. It controlled who could enter, where they could trade, how goods flowed through the city. Every merchant who wanted to bring goods into Londinium had to pass through one of the great gates: Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Bishopsgate, Aldgate, or the smaller posterns that opened onto the river, and every passage meant taxes paid, records kept, profits earned by those who understood how to work within the system. The gates themselves were marvels of Roman engineering and British craftsmanship. Picture Ludgate, the western entrance to the city, where the great road from Silchester and Winchester entered London. The gate was built of massive blocks of Kentish ragstone, its archway wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass each other comfortably. Above the arch, carved in stone that would outlast empires, were the words SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanos, the Senate and people of Rome, a reminder that this was not just a local project, but part of something vast and eternal. But carved alongside those Latin letters, if you knew where to look, were other symbols: British spirals and knots, Celtic faces peering out from decorative scroll work, the quiet assertion of local identity within imperial grandeur. The wall was Roman in conception and design, but it was built by British hands and British hearts, and it carried within its stones the dreams and aspirations of both peoples. Let me tell you about a particular day in the life of this walled city. A market day in early autumn, when the harvest was in and the trading season was reaching its peak before winter set in. The gates would have opened before dawn to admit the stream of farmers and merchants bringing their goods to market. Picture them passing under those great stone arches, British farmers with carts full of grain and wool, Gaulish wine merchants with their precious amphoras carefully padded with straw, Germanic traders bringing amber and furs from the northern forests, and perhaps even a few exotic merchants from the Mediterranean with their mysterious bundles of silk and spices. Inside the walls, the city was alive with commerce and conversation. The Forum, that great open space at the heart of Roman urban life, buzzed with activity as people gathered to conduct business, hear news, settle disputes, and simply enjoy the pleasure of being part of something larger than their individual lives. The Basilica, that great hall that served as both courthouse and commercial exchange, echoed with the voices of advocates arguing cases and merchants negotiating deals in a dozen different languages. But perhaps most remarkably, the wall allowed Londinium to develop its own unique character. its own way of being Roman while remaining essentially British. Protected by those stone ramparts, the city became a place where cultures could meet and mingle without losing their essential identities. Roman citizens learned to appreciate British poetry and music. British craftsmen mastered Roman techniques while maintaining their own artistic traditions. Gaulish merchants settled down and raised families, their children growing up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home with Caesar and with Celtic legends. The Wall also created London's first true neighborhoods, each with its own character and specialty. Near the river, inside what would later be called the Tower Ward, were the warehouses and docks where goods from across the empire were stored and sorted. The merchants who controlled this trade built themselves fine houses with heated floors and painted walls, gardens where Mediterranean herbs grew alongside British apples and pears. In the northwestern corner, near what would become the medieval Guildhall, skilled craftsmen established workshops that produced goods both for local use and for export across the province. These weren't just utilitarian items. London's craftsmen were creating objects of real beauty, jewelry that combined Roman techniques with British designs. Leather goods that were prized from Hadrian's Wall to the Rhine frontier, tools and weapons that carried the city's reputation for quality to the furthest corners of the empire. And in the evenings, when the gates were closed and the city settled into the quiet rhythm of domestic life, you could walk the streets inside the Wall and hear the sounds of a community at peace with itself. Children playing in the courtyards, women singing as they worked at their looms, men gathering in the taverns to discuss the day's business and share the latest news from Rome. The Wall gave London something precious: time. Time to grow, time to prosper, time to develop the deep roots that would allow it to survive the storms that lay ahead. Behind those protective ramparts, generations of Londoners would be born, live their lives, and die, each adding their own. Let me carry you now into the heart of Roman London at its most prosperous, around 250 AD, when the city had become the beating commercial heart of Britannia, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the tide, where ships from Gaul and Germania and distant Spain crowded the wharves, and where a clever merchant with good connections and better luck could rise from nothing to rival the wealth of senators. Close your eyes and breathe in the rich, complex aroma of a London morning in those golden years, the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries near Gracechurch Street, the tang of salt air from the Thames carrying news of incoming ships, the earthy scent of wool and leather from the warehouses, and threading through it all the exotic perfumes of trade, Spanish olive oil, Gaulish wine, British silver, and goods from so far away that their names were whispered like magical incantations. Picture yourself walking through the city in the company of a merchant named Gaius Aemilius Mercator. And yes, his surname really did mean merchant, for the Romans were nothing if not practical in their naming. Gaius had come to London 30 years earlier as a young man with nothing but ambition and a talent for languages, and now he was one of the wealthiest men in the province, his ships plying routes from the Rhine to the Scottish Islands, his warehouses storing goods that would eventually find their way to Rome itself. But Gaius hadn't achieved his success through grand gestures or spectacular risks. No, his wealth had been built one careful transaction at a time, one relationship at a time, one small profit at a time, until those small streams had become a great river of prosperity. Let me tell you about his typical day, because it reveals so much about what made London the commercial miracle it had become. Gaius would rise before dawn in his fine house near the Forum, a building that would have impressed visitors from Rome itself, with its central courtyard surrounded by rooms decorated with frescoes showing scenes from British and Roman mythology, its hypocaust heating system that kept the floors warm even in the depths of winter, its private bath suite where he could relax at the end of long days spent in negotiation and calculation. His first stop each morning was the harbor, where his agent Quintus would already be at work checking manifests and inspecting cargo. The London docks in those days were marvels of Roman engineering, stone quays that could accommodate ships of remarkable size, warehouses built to store goods safely through the changeable British weather, and cranes that could lift heavy cargo with an efficiency that wouldn't be matched again until the industrial age. On this particular morning, Gaius found Quintus supervising the unloading of a ship that had just arrived from Bordeaux with a cargo that represented the sophisticated trade networks of the empire. Amphora after amphora of wine, carefully selected from vineyards that Gaius had visited personally, each jar sealed and marked with symbols that told him exactly which vintage, which vineyard, which harvest he was receiving. But the wine was only part of the cargo. There was also bundles of fine cloth from workshops in Trier, jewelry from Gaulish craftsmen who had learned their techniques from Greek masters, glass vessels so delicate they seemed to capture light itself, and something even more precious, a small chest of documents, letters from other merchants, reports from his agents in distant cities, information that was worth more than gold to a man who understood how to use it. You see, what made Gaius successful wasn't just his ability to buy and sell goods. Any moderately intelligent person could do that. What set him apart was his understanding that information was the most valuable commodity of all. He knew which provinces had suffered bad harvests and would pay premium prices for grain. He knew which military units were being moved where and would need equipment and supplies. He knew which officials had been promoted, which new policies were being implemented, which trade routes were safe, and which were becoming dangerous. This knowledge came to him through a network of relationships that he had spent decades building, not just with other merchants, but with ship captains who carried his goods and his messages, with innkeepers who heard travelers' gossip, with scribes in government offices who knew which way the political winds were blowing, with tribal chiefs in the unconquered north who might have silver to trade or information to sell. After checking on the ship from Bordeaux, Gaius would make his way to the Forum, where the day's real business began. Picture the scene. Hundreds of merchants, traders, and craftsmen gathering in the great open space, their voices creating a multilingual symphony of commerce that would have made the Tower of Babel seem quiet by comparison. Latin was the official language of trade, of course, but you could hear Celtic languages from Britain and Gaul, Germanic dialects from the Rhine frontier, and occasionally even more exotic tongues from merchants who had traveled routes that stretched beyond the edges of the Roman world. The Forum wasn't just a place for buying and selling goods. It was London's nerve center, where information flowed as freely as wine at a festival. Gaius would spend hours here, not just conducting his own business, but listening, observing, building the mental map of opportunities and dangers that would guide his decisions in the weeks and months to come. On this particular day, he learned that a new governor had been appointed in Gaul, a man with the reputation for ambitious public works projects, which meant opportunities for suppliers of building materials and skilled craftsmen. He heard rumors that the northern tribes were restless again, which might mean increased military activity and demand for supplies, but could also mean disruption of the trade routes that brought silver south from the Scottish mines. Most interestingly, he received word that a merchant fleet for Alexandria had been spotted in the waters around Gaul, ships carrying goods from Egypt and perhaps even from the mysterious lands beyond, silks that had traveled the length of Asia, spices that could transform even the simplest British meal into something extraordinary, precious stones that Roman ladies would pay fortunes to own. This was the kind of information that could make or break a merchant's fortune. If Gaius could position himself to intercept some of that eastern trade, if he could arrange to have those exotic goods brought to London and then distributed throughout Britannia, the profits could be enormous. But it would require careful planning, substantial investment, and partnerships with merchants whose reputation and resources matched his own. After the morning's business in the Forum, Gaius would often spend his afternoons in his private office above his main warehouse, a room that served as the command center for his far-flung commercial empire. The walls were covered with maps showing not just the geography of the Roman world, but the patterns of trade and profit that only an experienced merchant could read. There were charts showing seasonal variations in prices for different commodities, lists of reliable ship captains and their schedules, detailed records of which officials in different provinces could be trusted and which required careful handling. But perhaps most remarkably, Gaius kept what he called his Book of Dreams, a careful record of opportunities he had noticed but hadn't yet been able to pursue, markets he thought could be developed, products he believed could find new customers, partnerships that might prove profitable if the right moment arose. One of the dreams he had been nurturing for years was the possibility of establishing regular trade with Ireland, Hibernia, as the Romans called it. The island remained unconquered and largely unknown, but Gaius had met Irish traders in the markets of Gaul and had been impressed by the quality of their metalwork and the stories they told of their island's resources. If he could establish peaceful trade relations there, if he could convince Irish craftsmen to work with Roman merchants, there might be profits that would make even his current success seem modest. As evening fell and the business of the day wound down, Gaius would often walk the streets of his beloved London, observing the city that had made his dreams possible. He would see British craftsmen working by lamplight in their workshops, creating goods that would travel to the farthest corners of the empire. He would pass taverns where merchants from a dozen provinces gathered to share wine and stories, where deals were struck and partnerships. Now let me take you into the quieter corners of Roman London, away from the bustling Forum and the busy harbor, into the sacred spaces where ancient mysteries met daily devotions, where the spirits of the living and the dead mingled in ways both comforting and profound. Close your eyes and let your mind drift to a misty dawn in 3rd century Londinium, when the city's bells had not yet been invented, but the day began with other, older rhythms. The chanting from the temples, the whispered prayers at household shrines, the soft footsteps of mourners making their way to the cemeteries beyond the walls. Picture yourself walking with a young woman named Claudia Rufina, a Romano-British citizen whose family had prospered in the wool trade. Today she has a sacred duty to perform. It's the anniversary of her grandmother's death, and she must make the journey to the family tomb in the great necropolis that stretched along the roads leading out of London, where the dead of 3 centuries lay in eternal sleep, their graves telling stories of lives lived, loves lost, and hopes that transcended the boundaries between this world and whatever lay beyond. But before we visit the dead, let me show you the living faith of Roman London, the remarkable tapestry of beliefs and practices that made the city a spiritual crossroads, just as surely as it was a commercial one. The Romans, you see, were remarkably practical about religion. They honored their own gods, certainly, but they were quite willing to acknowledge that other people's deities might have real power too. This wasn't the theological hair-splitting that would characterize later religious debates. It was more like a divine insurance policy. Better to honor too many gods than to offend the wrong one by neglect. So, as Claudia made her way through the morning streets, she would pass temples and shrines that represented a remarkable diversity of spiritual traditions. There was the great temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the highest hill, its columns gleaming white in the early sun, where the official ceremonies of Roman state religion were performed with all the pomp and precision that the empire demanded. But right next to it, you might find a smaller shrine to Sulis Minerva, the Romano-British goddess who combined the Roman Minerva with the Celtic deity Sulis, patroness of hot springs and sacred waters. The smell of incense would drift from these sacred places, frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from distant Egypt, and simpler offerings too, the smoke of burning barley and honey cakes that even the poorest citizens could afford to offer to the gods. Mixed with these exotic perfumes would be the more familiar scents of British flowers and herbs, vervain and meadowsweet, rowan berries and hawthorn blossoms, offerings that spoke to older, deeper connections between the people and the land. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of London's religious life was how it reflected the city's role as a meeting place of cultures. In the merchants' quarter near the river, you could find a Mithraeum, a temple to Mithras, the soldier's god who had come to Britain with the legions, but whose mysteries were now celebrated by civilians as well. The Mithraeum was always built underground, as dark and mysterious as a cave, where initiates gathered to reenact the cosmic struggle between light and darkness that lay at the heart of their faith. Imagine descending into such a place with Claudia, feeling your way down stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, guided only by the flickering light of oil lamps. The air would be thick with the scent of burning cedar and the more earthy smell of the underground chamber itself. Along the walls, carved reliefs would tell the story of Mithras slaying the cosmic bull, his cloak billowing around him like the star-scattered darkness of night, while smaller figures representing the signs of the zodiac looked on from their eternal dance around the edges of time. The ceremonies held in such places were profound and moving, rituals of death and rebirth, of initiation and transformation, that spoke to deep human needs for meaning and belonging. Men who had faced death in battle, merchants who risked their fortunes on uncertain voyages, craftsmen whose livelihood depended on skills that could fail or desert them, all found comfort in a religion that promised that struggle and sacrifice were part of a greater cosmic purpose. But Claudia's own spiritual life was more complex than any single tradition could encompass. Like many Romano-British citizens, she honored the Roman gods while maintaining a deep connection to the older deities of the land. Her family kept a household shrine, a laudarium, where small bronze figurines of the family's protective spirits stood alongside offerings of food and wine. But they also made regular pilgrimages to sacred springs and groves outside the city, places where the ancient gods of hill and stream still held sway, where the old rituals were still performed in the old language, where the connection between human life and the natural world remained strong and immediate. On this particular morning, as she made her way toward the cemetery, Claudia carried with her a small woven basket containing the offerings she would leave at her grandmother's tomb: a cup of wine mixed with honey, some fresh bread, coins for the ferryman who would carry souls across the river of death, and most precious of all, a small bronze mirror that had belonged to her grandmother, polished to a brightness that would reflect not just faces, but souls. The walk to the necropolis took her along one of the great roads that led out from the city gates, past the workshops and industrial areas where potters and metal workers pursued their trades, past the market gardens where vegetables and fruits were grown to feed the city's appetite. But gradually the landscape of the living gave way to the landscape of the dead. First scattered individual tombs of wealthy families, then denser concentrations of graves, and finally the great cemetery itself, stretching along both sides of the road like a city built for eternal residence. Roman burial practices were strict and specific. The dead could not be buried within the city walls, both for reasons of public health and because the presence of death would pollute the sacred spaces where the living worshipped their gods. But this didn't mean that the dead were forgotten or ignored. Instead, the great roads leading out from London became galleries of memory, lined with tombs and monuments that told the stories of lives lived and achievements remembered. Some of these monuments were grand affairs, elaborate mausoleums built by wealthy families, decorated with carved scenes from mythology, inscribed with lengthy poems that celebrated the virtues of the deceased. But others were simpler and in many ways more moving. Small headstones that recorded the basic facts of ordinary lives, the names and ages of children who had died too young, the proud declarations of freed slaves who had earned their liberty and wanted it remembered, the touching epitaphs that spoke of love that would endure beyond death itself. Claudia's grandmother lay in a tomb that was neither the grandest nor the simplest in the cemetery, but it was perfect for its purpose. A rectangular stone chamber, partly underground, where several generations of the family would eventually rest together. The entrance was marked by a carved relief showing the old woman in the prime of life, holding symbols of her earthly accomplishments, a distaff and spindle that marked her as a skilled weaver, a key that indicated her role as the keeper of the household, and most touchingly, a small dog that had been her faithful companion in life and would, according to British belief, guide her spirit in death. As Claudia arranged her offerings on the stone altar built into the tomb's entrance, she whispered prayers in both Latin and the older British tongue her grandmother had taught her as a child. She poured the honeyed wine onto the earth, letting it seep down to nourish the roots of the rosemary and thyme that grew wild around the tomb. She broke the bread and scattered the crumbs for the birds. Let me carry you now toward the end of our story, into the 4th century AD, when shadows were beginning to lengthen across the Roman world, when the great empire that had seemed eternal was showing the first signs of the mortality that touches all human endeavors. But this isn't a tale of sudden collapse or dramatic endings. No, the decline of Roman London was more like a sunset, beautiful in its own way, full of golden moments and quiet dignity, a slow fade rather than a sharp cut to darkness. Picture yourself in the London of 350 AD, walking through streets that would still seem magnificent to modern eyes, but carried within them the subtle signs of change that only those who knew how to look would notice. The great buildings were still maintained, the walls still stood strong, the harbor still welcomed ships from across the empire. But if you listened carefully to the conversations in the forum, if you watched the faces of the merchants and officials, if you paid attention to the small details that reveal the health of a civilization, you would sense something shifting, something changing, like the first cool breath of autumn on what had seemed an endless summer day. Our guide through this twilight world is an elderly man named Lucius Britannicus, a name that tells its own story, for he was born in London to a Romano-British family that had been part of the city's elite for 3 generations. At 75 years old, Lucius had seen the empire at its height and was now witnessing its transformation into something different, something that wasn't quite the same, but wasn't quite gone either. Lucius had spent his career as what the Romans called a curialis, a member of the city council, one of those prosperous citizens who were expected to contribute their wealth and energy to maintaining the public works, the temples, the festivals, all the elaborate machinery that kept Roman civilization running smoothly. In his younger days, this had been an honor eagerly sought after, a mark of status that brought respect and influence. But now, as the costs of maintaining the empire grew heavier and the resources to meet them grew scarcer, being a curialis felt more like a burden than a privilege. Still, Lucius took pride in his duties, and on this particular morning he was making his regular inspection of the city's defenses, not because he expected an imminent attack, but because maintaining the walls was one of the sacred responsibilities that connected him to generations of his predecessors. As he walked along the ramparts, accompanied by Marcus Flavius, the captain of the city guard, he could look down on a London that was still undeniably impressive. The population had grown to perhaps 50,000 souls, Romans, Britons, Gauls, Germans, and peoples from the farthest corners of the empire, all drawn by the opportunities that the city still offered. The harbor was busy with ships carrying goods to and from Gaul, the Low Countries, and the Rhine frontier. The workshops still produced pottery and metalwork that was prized throughout Britain and beyond. The bathhouses still echoed with conversation and laughter. The theaters still drew crowds for performances of classical plays and contemporary entertainments. But change was visible too, if you knew where to look. Many of the grand private houses built during the city's golden age now stood empty, their owners having retreated to fortified villas in the countryside or moved to other cities where opportunities seemed more promising. Some of the smaller temples had been abandoned, their congregations dwindling as newer religions gained followers. The great public works projects that had once been sources of civic pride were now undertaken more reluctantly, with careful calculations of cost and benefit that would have been unthinkable in earlier, more optimistic times. Let me carry you now toward the end of our story, into the 4th century AD, when shadows were beginning to lengthen across the Roman world, when the great empire that had seemed eternal was showing the first signs of the mortality that touches all human endeavors. But this isn't a tale of sudden collapse or dramatic endings. No, the decline of Roman London was more like a sunset, beautiful in its own way, full of golden moments and quiet dignity, a slow fade rather than a sharp cut to darkness. Picture yourself in the London of 350 AD, walking through streets that would still seem magnificent to modernize, but carried within them the subtle signs of change that only those who knew how to look would notice. The great buildings were still maintained, the walls still stood strong, the harbor still welcomed ships from across the empire. But if you listened carefully to the conversations in the forum, if you watched the faces of the merchants and officials, if you paid attention to the small details that reveal the health of a civilization, you would sense something shifting, something changing, like the first cool breath of autumn on what had seemed an endless summer day. Our guide through this twilight world is an elderly man named Lucius Britannicus, a name that tells its own story, for he was born in London to a Romano-British family that had been part of the city's elite for 3 generations. At 75 years old, Lucius had seen the empire at its height and was now witnessing its transformation into something different, something that wasn't quite the same but wasn't quite gone either. Lucius had spent his career as what the Romans called a curialis, a member of the city council, one of those prosperous citizens who were expected to contribute their wealth and energy to maintaining the public works, the temples, the festivals, all the elaborate machinery that kept Roman civilization running smoothly. In his younger days, this had been an honor eagerly sought after, a mark of status that brought respect and influence. But now, as the costs of maintaining the empire grew heavier and the resources to meet them grew scarcer, being a curialis felt more like a burden than a privilege. Still, Lucius took pride in his duties, and on this particular morning, he was making his regular inspection of the city's defenses, not because he expected an imminent attack, but because maintaining the walls was one of the sacred responsibilities that connected him to generations of his predecessors. As he walked along the ramparts, accompanied by Marcus Flavius, the captain of the city guard, he could look down on a London that was still undeniably impressive. The population had grown to perhaps 50,000 souls, Romans, Britons, Gauls, Germans, and peoples from the farthest corners of the empire, all drawn by the opportunities that the city still offered. The harbor was busy with ships carrying goods to and from Gaul, the Low Countries, and the Rhine frontier. The workshops still produced pottery and metalwork that was prized throughout Britain and beyond. The bathhouses still echoed with conversation and laughter. The theater still drew crowds for performances of classical plays and contemporary entertainments. But change was visible too, if you knew where to look. Many of the grand private houses built during the city's golden age now stood empty, their owners having retreated to fortified villas in the countryside, or moved to other cities where opportunities seemed more promising. Some of the smaller temples had been abandoned, their congregations dwindling as newer religions gained followers. The great public works projects that had once been sources of civic pride were now undertaken more reluctantly, with careful calculations of cost and benefit that would have been unthinkable in earlier, more optimistic times. Most significantly, the army was changing. The legions that had conquered Britain and built London were mostly gone now, replaced by auxiliary units recruited from Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine. These weren't necessarily inferior soldiers. Many were skilled warriors with their own proud traditions, but they served for different reasons, with different loyalties, different dreams of what the future might hold. as Lucius and Marcus walked the walls, they encountered one of these new soldiers, a young Frankish warrior named Clodio, whose grandfather had fought against Rome, but now wore Roman armor and drew Roman pay. Clodio spoke Latin with a heavy accent, practiced a form of Christianity that would have seemed strange to earlier generations, and sent most of his earnings back to his family across the Channel. He was loyal to his immediate commanders and proud of his service, but the empire he served was an abstraction to him, less real than the tribal bonds and personal relationships that gave his life its deepest meaning. Yet there was no hostility in these encounters, no sense of impending conflict or cultural warfare. Clodio had learned to appreciate Roman engineering and organization, while Lucius had developed a genuine respect for the courage and skill of the Germanic warriors. They shared jokes about the British weather, complained together about the quality of army rations, and found common ground in their professional dedication to keeping the city safe and prosperous. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about Roman London's decline. It wasn't a collapse so much as a gradual transformation, a slow blending of old and new that created something different, but not necessarily inferior. The Roman system of law and administration continued to function, but it incorporated Germanic customs and traditions. Latin remained the language of government and trade, but it was increasingly mixed with Celtic and Germanic words and phrases. Roman architectural styles persisted, but they were modified by local preferences and practical considerations. In the afternoon, Lucius often visited the home of his friend Quintus Caecilius Metellus, a merchant whose family had been trading partners with Lucius's family for generations. Quintus was facing decisions that would have been unthinkable in earlier times, whether to maintain his operations in London or to move his headquarters to one of the newer trading centers that were emerging along the northern frontiers, where the empire's relationship with the barbarian kingdoms was creating new opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Their conversations, conducted in the comfortable library of Quintus's house, while they shared wine that still came from the same vineyards their grandfathers had patronized, were typical of the complex calculations that defined life in 4th century London. The old systems were still functioning, but they required constant adjustment and adaptation. The old certainties were giving way to new possibilities that were both exciting and terrifying. Quintus had recently received letters from merchants in Trier and Cologne, cities that remained firmly within the Roman sphere, but were developing their own approaches to the challenges of governing and defending territories that were increasingly difficult to hold. There was talk of new arrangements with Gothic and Vandal kingdoms, of trading agreements that blurred the traditional distinctions between Romans and barbarians, of political solutions that would have scandalized earlier generations but seemed practical and even necessary now. But perhaps the most fascinating conversations in Quintus's library concerned religion. The old Roman gods were still honored in public ceremonies, but privately, more and more of the city's elite were exploring the newer faiths that promised more personal relationships with the divine. Christianity was gaining ground, but so were other Eastern religions. Mithraism continued to attract followers, particularly among the military, and mystery cults from Egypt and Persia offered initiations that promised salvation and eternal life. Lucius himself had become increasingly interested in these questions as he aged. The traditional Roman approach to religion, dutiful performance of public rituals combined with philosophical speculation about the nature of the gods, no longer seemed adequate to the spiritual challenges of his time. He found himself drawn to Christian teachings about love and forgiveness, but he also appreciated the intellectual sophistication of Neoplatonic philosophy and the practical wisdom of the old Celtic traditions that his British ancestors had maintained beneath the surface of Roman culture. As evening fell and the two old friends shared their final cup of wine, they would often talk about their children and grandchildren, wondering what kind of world they were inheriting, what opportunities and challenges lay ahead for the next generation. These weren't conversations filled with despair or resignation. Both men had lived long enough to understand that change was the only constant in human affairs.